أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماءه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون الذي لا يدركه بعد الهمم ولا يناله غوص الفطن الذي ليس لصفته حد محدود ولا نعت موجود ولا وقت معدود ولا أجل ممدود أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم سيقول السفهاء من الناس ما ولاهم عن قبلتهم التي كانوا عليها قل لله المشرق والمغرب يهدي من يشاء إلى صراط مستقيم وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا وما جعلنا القبلة التي كنت عليها إلا لنعلم من يتبع الرسول ممن ينقلب على عقبيه وإنها لكبيرة إلا على الذين هدى الله وما كان الله ليضيع إيمانكم إن الله بالناس لرؤوف رحيم صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Tonight we'll continue, inshallah, with the topic of asking why in Islam, exploring the wisdoms and the reasons behind Islamic rulings. Last night we began our discussion by explaining that generally speaking, Islam does not see the idea of asking why in a negative light. It seems as though when the angels initially asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the human being? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not admonish them. He did not criticize them for this question. If anything, He took the time to demonstrate for them the reason why He had created Adam. He showed to them the difference between Adam and the angels, how Adam could learn these new names, whatever those names are, and how the angels would have not been able to do so. And we said when we look even further into the seerah of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, you also find that they also did not shut down questions that started with this word, why. When people used to come to them, they used to entertain these questions. We saw this in the seerah of our mother, Lady Fatimiyya Zahra, salawatullahi salamu alayha. And not only did they entertain these questions, in fact, you find the first Imam sat on the minbar, as narrated multiple times within our books of hadith, and uttered a line that no other companion of the Prophet ever uttered, and that was, Saluni qabla an tafqiduni. Ask me before you lose me. And therefore you found that they were very open about the idea of people coming and asking why as it relates to religious teaching. So much so that you have a book that has compiled many of these narrations. It's a compilation by Shaykh as-Saduq, one of our earliest scholars of the 4th century. And that book is called Ilalu Shara'i', the reasons behind legislations. Therefore, this was part and parcel of the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt. We said if you look at these questions that start with why, they fall under two main categories. The first of those categories is when someone asks why, and they're asking why in order for you to present to them the proof that this practice is part of Islam. A Sunni person might ask you, why do you do sajda on the turba? They are asking, what's the verse or what's the hadith that tells you to do so? You might ask a Sunni person, why is it that you cross your hands in salat? You're not asking for the wisdom and the benefit and the philosophy. You're asking for the verse or hadith that says you're supposed to do so. You might ask someone from Ahlul Sunnah, why do you pray Taraweeh? Why do you consider Taraweeh to be mustahab? When you're asking this question, you're not asking for some scientific reasoning behind Taraweeh. You're asking because you want to see, when the Prophet was alive, did he pray this salat in jama'ah or not? You're asking for the proof that this is part of the religion. This first why, we said you have to ask it. And if you can't ask it, someone has to do so on your behalf. And that is none but your marja. The marja, his job is basically this. Every time someone claims something to be wajib or haram, the marja asks why. And he asks for proof. And then he scrutinizes that proof. There's a second type of why. That second type of why is understanding the wisdom, benefit, and philosophy behind a particular Islamic ruling. Sometimes someone might ask, why do I pray 5 times a day? He's not asking for a verse or a hadith that tells him to do so. He already knows this is part of the faith. He's asking for the benefits. He's asking for the wisdom, the philosophy. Why not 6? Why is it not 4, for example? Why is it 5 in particular? Why do we fast in Ramadan? He's asking for the benefits, for the wisdom. We said this second type of why, there is also no problem in Islam asking this one. Except one cannot ask from the angle of questioning and challenging. And sometimes people do ask from that angle. It's different when I come and say, I'm going to practice salat 5 times a day anyways. But I might as well know why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated this. Versus a person who's asking in the sense that unless you tell me why, I'm not going to practice it anymore. These two are very different from each other. And the second is definitely a problem. This is where we ended our discussion. The last question we brought up was, at the end of the day, if there are rules that we don't know the wisdom behind them, there is wisdom behind them, but we are not aware of them, couldn't have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala simply shared the wisdom behind all these rulings? Wouldn't have that made life so much easier for you and I? Wouldn't have that made your discussion with anyone about your faith so much of an easier, more interesting discussion? You see, with everything happening in Palestine nowadays, so many people are picking up the Quran. Wouldn't it have been easier if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran had shared scientific reasons for every Islamic ruling? Wouldn't it be so easy, so amazing, that this person, the moment he picks up the Quran, sees all this science, says, oh, this is definitely the truth. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and by extension the Ahlul Bayt, for whatever reason, decided not to share the wisdom behind every single ruling. Some they did, some, the more detailed ones, they may have not shared all of the wisdom behind it. Why is this is the topic that we want to get into tonight. And in order to do so, we'll pose the following questions. Number one, why hasn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Ahlul Bayt shared the reason behind every Islamic ruling? Every time the Quran says do this, why didn't God just share the wisdom behind it as well? The benefit behind it as well. Number two, why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ask the Muslims to pray towards Jerusalem and pray towards Masjid-ul-Aqsa for 13 years before he switched the Qibla towards Mecca and towards Al-Masjidul Haram? Number three, how are some rulings in Islam legislated with the whole community in mind, as opposed to being legislated for each and every individual? Number four, why are there certain types of music that are haram to listen to that may not necessarily have a negative impact on me personally? Number five, is it possible that some rules can have multiple reasons behind them, and that if I was able to find out one of the reasons behind it, this would not negate that there could be multiple other reasons behind that ruling as well? And number six, and finally, is it fundamentally a knock against Islam, a flaw of Islam, that in Islam we do not know the wisdom behind hundreds of detailed rulings? Or is this what makes Islam what it is? Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 6 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Let us begin from here. The idea of explaining the wisdom behind different rulings is something you definitely find in the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt. And in particular, in the seerah of Lady Fatimah Zahra, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayha. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Where do you find this? Amongst other places that you find this in fact in the famous khutbah of Lady Fatima in the masjid, where she came and recited the famous khutbah known as khutbah Fatimiyya. As we mentioned, Balaghatun Nisa has narrated this, as well as later on Allama Majlisi in his Biharul Anwar, volume number 8, he quotes Lady Fatima in this khutbah. The khutbah itself is quite lengthy, and that is in some ways what mesmerized the people who were there. Because this was Fatima who was speaking, but it's almost as if the Prophet is speaking. This is the type of eloquence that she carried. It was also the type of knowledge that she carried. In the beginning of the khutbah, known as khutbah Fatimiyya, as Lady Fatima is explaining to these people who are sitting there, that all of them are in debt to her father, because if it wasn't for her father, these quote-unquote Muslims at this point would not have anything that they have today. They would be still living in a very rudimentary level. They would still be drinking polluted water. They would still be hunting lizards for their lunch, as the khutbah says. As she continues with this, she starts to recount the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brought to these people. And as part of those blessings, she points out nearly 20 different Islamic teachings. Except as she points out every Islamic teaching, she also points out why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislated that teaching. Yes, this is somewhere in the midst of the khutbah, before she gets to the issue of inheritance in particular, which is the main issue in the khutbah of Fadak, or khutbah Fatimiyya. Before she gets to that issue in particular, she speaks about these different teachings and what is the wisdom behind them. Therefore, this is part of the seerah of the Ahlul Bayt, that sometimes at least, when they mention the ruling, they also mention with it what? The wisdom behind it. Hence you find, she says, فَجَعَلَ اللَّهُ إِيمَانًا تَطْهِيرًا لَكُم مِّنَ الشِّرْكِ. He told you to have faith to keep you away from shirk. And then she says, وَالصَّلَاةَ تَنْزِيهًا لَكُم مِّنَ الْكِبْرِ. And He made salat wajib for you. Why? In order to remove kibr and arrogance from your heart. وَالزَّكَاةَ نِمَاءً فِي الرِّزْقِ. And He made zakat wajib on you in order to do what? To increase in your rizq. And وَالصِّيَامَ تَثْبِيتًا لِلْإِخْلَاصِ. And He made fasting wajib in order to bring you more certainty on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Make your intentions more pure intentions. وَالْحَجَّ تَشْيِيدًا لِلدِّينِ. And He made hajj wajib in order to solidify faith in your hearts. You see this very clearly. Someone goes to hajj, your children, they go for hajj, for example, immediately you see they connect with their faith so much more. 20 nearly teachings. Lady Fatima mentions the teaching, and then she also mentions what? She also mentions the wisdom, the benefit behind that teaching. Therefore, this was part and parcel of their seerah. Except the problem is, they did not do this in every situation. As we mentioned yesterday, hundreds of Islamic rulings, the more detailed ones, we don't know the wisdom behind them. Yes, salat was legislated to remove kibr from your heart. Great. But why is it that I have to do salat, for example, starting with takbiratul ihram and not anything else? Why is it I have to do 2 sajdas and not 1? Why is it I have to do ruku' before I do these 2 sajdas? Some of these we may not know the wisdom behind them. Some they have shared, some they have not shared. Couldn't I have shared all the wisdoms behind it? Wouldn't it have made faith so much easier if you and I knew the wisdom behind every single one of these rulings? There are 2 main reasons why the Ahlul Bayt and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not share with us the full wisdom behind every single teaching. Those are the 2, inshallah, we're going to get into. Allah salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. The first reason is this. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had shared with you the wisdom behind every ruling, first thing to keep in mind is that even if He had done that, you still wouldn't accept it from Him. So here you are sitting, Ya Allah, if you had only told me What's the wisdom behind this ruling? And God is saying, listen, even if I shared the wisdom with you, would you accept it from me or would you argue with me? It's like, sometimes kids, they tell their parents, but why? Yes, my son, I was on the phone with him last night. 5-year-old, yes? He said, did you buy me a Lego? I said, no. He said, why? I said, the stores didn't have it. That's the store I went to, a particular store, it didn't have it. Then he kept asking, why? I said, I don't know, you have to ask the manager in the store, yes? So the first point is, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had shared with you, would you accept it? The answer is no, we would not accept it from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You know how I know this? Because He has already shared it with us in certain situations and we don't accept it from Him. A very easy example of this are the different rules, responsibilities, and duties that a man has and a woman has, yes? The man has certain tasks, duties, responsibilities. The woman has a separate set of duties and responsibilities. You ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala why? He says, well, they're different. I created them different, so the rules are different. Do we accept that from Him? No. So He's the one who created everyone. He says, I created these two differently from one another. Therefore, their duties and responsibilities, different. And you and I are sitting there and saying, I don't know. To me, they seem like the same. To me, I don't think I can accept this logic. He's already told you the wisdom behind some of these rulings. You won't accept it from Him. Yes? Sometimes because simply, forgive me, we are so arrogant that even if God tells us the wisdom, we're not going to accept it from Him. Second reason why sometimes we won't accept it from Him is because sometimes the wisdom behind a particular ruling is mainly just to see who's going to obey God in that test. And this doesn't sound like good enough of a reason for you and I. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when you go and put your head on turba, I'm using this as an example, yes, just as an example. If the main reason was to see if you would obey Him or not, you would immediately be disappointed. You would say, what kind of reason is this? No, give me some scientific reason. Tell me when my head touches the dirt, it connects to the energy in the earth and all of this. That's what you and I are looking for. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, no, sometimes I tell you to do something mainly because I want to see. It's going to separate those who obey from those who disobey. Where do we see this very clearly? In the story of the Muslims when they were praying towards the first qibla of the Muslimin. Yes, Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, that the Muslims were praying in that direction. For how many years were the Muslims praying in that direction? Nearly 13 years at the very least. The time that the Prophet was in Mecca, they were praying towards Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, which is Jerusalem. Now, of course, when they came to Medina, at some point or another in Medina earlier, it changed from Jerusalem to Mecca. And this change, of course, was a major change, because if you look at the map, Jerusalem is to the north of Medina, or the northwest of Medina. And Mecca, for those who have been, is to the south of Medina. So imagine you're praying northwest, and then the next day they tell you from now on you have to pray which direction? You have to pray towards south. It wasn't a 10-15 degree difference. This was nearly 100-150 degree difference, yes? Okay, so the reason for the change in Qibla, pay attention, this is a little bit technical. The reason for the change of Qibla, the Quran speaks of, because the Quran says the Jews were giving the Muslims a hard time over this. And they were giving the Prophet a hard time over this. They used to tell the Prophet, Ya Rasulullah, O Muhammad, your message is nothing new. You're stealing our Qibla. You're using our Qibla. This faith of yours is not a new one. This didn't bother the Prophet himself. But for those who were following him, this was a means of, it was bothersome for them. Yes? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we see you when you come late at night and you look at the skies, waiting for our command to change the Qibla from the direction of Jerusalem, or some other solution that you are waiting for us to produce for you. Okay, so why did the Qibla change from Jerusalem towards Mecca? Easy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted the Muslims have their own Qibla, have their own identity. Easy. The question that remains though, is why is it that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala kept this rule for 13 years? Think about it for a second. The Prophet, in his whole life as a Prophet, he has prayed more towards Jerusalem than he's prayed towards Mecca. If you think about it, 13 years in Mecca, 10 years in Medina. 13 years he's prayed towards Jerusalem. Why? Why didn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the beginning come and just say pray towards Mecca? We understand the reason behind the switch. There's a separate identity for the Muslims. But why start with Jerusalem to begin with? Well, the Quran tells us in Surah Al-Baqarah, what do we read? These are the verses I started with. سَيَقُولُ السُّفَهَاء. The people who don't know anything, they're going to start running their mouth. When you switch your qibla, they're going to say, مَا وَاللَّهُمْ عَنْ قِبْلَتِهِمُ الَّتِي كَانُوا عَلَيْهَا. Why are they switching the qibla now and all of this kind of stuff? And the Quran says, قُلْ لِلَّهِ الْمَشْرِقُ وَالْمَغْرِبُ. The east and the west belongs to me, so I decide where you're going to do your salat towards. Okay, great. The verses continue. Then the Quran says this, وَمَا جَعَلْنَا الْقِبْلَةَ الَّتِي كُنْتَ عَلَيْهَا. And we didn't make the initial qibla, the first qibla, not the second one. Second one, we know why it was legislated. The first one, الْقِبْلَةَ الَّتِي كُنْتَ عَلَيْهَا, the one you used to pray towards. وَمَا جَعَلْنَا الْقِبْلَةَ الَّتِي كُنْتَ عَلَيْهَا إِلَّا, the only reason why we did it, لِنَعْلَمَ مَنْ يَتَّبِعُ الرَّسُولُ مِمَّنْ يَنْقَلِبُ عَلَىٰ عَقِبَيْهِ. We wanted to see who was going to obey the prophets versus those who would separate themselves from the prophets. Sometimes the wisdom behind a ruling is what? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to see if you're going to obey. Is that good enough of a reason for you and I? Typically it's not. We're disappointed. What's the scientific reason behind it? What's the philosophical reason behind it? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, I did this لِنَعْلَمَ, so that we would know who was going to obey versus who was not going to obey. This is another reason why we would argue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if He shared the wisdom of certain rulings with us. Allah salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. The third reason why we would argue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is because sometimes the reasoning behind a ruling is set based on the whole community and not based on the individual. This is technical. Yes? Sometimes when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislates a ruling, He is looking at a Muslim community with 5,000 people in there, for example. And He knows that I have to make this deed haram. Why? Because if this deed is haram, out of these 5,000 individuals, most of them will never even come near it. Now, out of those 5,000, is it possible that some of them might engage in this deed and won't go to an extreme with it? It's possible. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala still considers that deed to be haram. Why? Because the majority of the community, if they engage in that deed, they will take it to an extreme. Hence Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala considered it haram for everybody. The ruling is legislated based on community. You want to see a very typical good example of this? Look at the example of wine, khamr. In our fiqh, any marja you ask, he will tell you, you cannot be sitting at a table where others are drinking wine. Now, question for you, when you sit at a table where others are drinking wine, does that mean you're necessarily going to, God forbid, pick up that wine and drink it too? No, not necessarily. They will tell you, you can't sit at that table. They will tell you wine is najis, even if you touch it, you have to keep distance from it. Yes? But isn't it possible for someone to sit at the same table and still not end up drinking this wine? It's possible. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't legislate this per individual. He legislated it for the whole community. What does this mean? He says, when I look at this whole community, the majority of them, if wine is part and parcel of their lives, eventually this community is going to become a community that is going to what? Engage in drinking this wine. Hence Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes it haram for everybody to even sit at that table. Does that make sense? Sometimes someone might say, well, I might sit at the table, I'm strong enough not to drink. Well, guess what? It's haram for you too. Because the ruling is based on the community. It's not based on every single individual. Out of 5,000 people, maybe 100, 200 are strong enough that even if they sit at that table 100 times, they will never end up drinking this wine. Yes? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't legislate Islam for 100 people. Islam was legislated for thousands of people. And of the thousands, the majority eventually will end up engaging with this. You find this with other rulings as well. You go to your marja, you say, what type of music is haram? He says, the type of music they use in haram gatherings is haram for you to listen to, even if it doesn't have a negative impact on you personally. Why? Because Islam doesn't even want this to be a part of your life. It's based on community. Why? Because if this music makes it into your house, you may not be negatively impacted by it directly. What about your child? What about 90% of the other people out there? Eventually, they're going to be impacted negatively. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala takes into consideration the whole community. Another example you will find in the rulings of our Maraja, including Ayatul Sistani. He has ihtiyat wajib on this. That you are not allowed to play with things that are otherwise predominantly used for gambling. Even if I'm not gambling. Yes, you're playing cards. According to Ayatul Sistani, ihtiyat wajib, that is a problem. But ya Allah, I'm not gambling with it. He says, yes, but if this makes its way into your community, eventually a lot of people are going to end up gambling with it. Therefore, I'm going to take a step back. Consider it haram for anybody to play with anything that is predominantly used for gambling. And a multitude of other rulings you have of this sort as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislates rules sometimes based off of the full community in mind, not just based off of the individual effect. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told this, would we accept it from Him? No, we would argue with Him. Oh, Ya Allah, it doesn't have a negative effect on me personally. Because mashallah, we all think we're superhuman, yes? We all think we're never negatively impacted. Everybody else negatively impacted, yes? These are reasons why we would argue with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That brings me to the second reason. First reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't shared the wisdom behind these rulings. Because even if He had, we would have argued with Him for these 3 or 4 reasons. Number 2, this is the crux of the discussion. The second reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't shared the wisdom behind all of these rulings with us is because of the following. Islam is a faith. It's a matter of belief. Yes? Pay attention to this line. It's a bit technical. Faith, belief, iman only applies when there is something that is hidden. One more time. When you call something faith, when you call it belief, that means there is some element in this process that is hidden. You can't see it with your own 2 eyes, but you believe in it anyways. If someone goes outside right now and sees, all of us can see right now, it's nighttime. Does anyone come back and say, I believe it's nighttime? Nobody says that. He says, I see it's nighttime. If anyone is in here and the lights are on, do they say, I believe the lights are on? It doesn't say that. Why? Because here you can see everything with your own 2 eyes. Therefore, belief, faith, iman, doesn't even have a place here. Does this make sense? Yes, belief, faith is when there is at least some hidden element in this process. That is why the beginning of the Quran says what? Alif, Lam, Mim. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِي هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ. Why doesn't the Quran say يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالشَّهَادَةِ? Because if you can see it, you can see it. There's no more iman anymore. There's no more faith anymore. There's no more belief anymore. That's not faith and belief anymore. That's science. Science gives you the proof for things. You look at it, it's tangible. You can see it under the microscope and khalas, you're done. You don't need to believe in anything. No scientist has ever come to you and say, I believe this. I believe your hand has some microbes on it. That's not what a scientist says. He says, I saw with the microscope, your hand has what on it? Has microbes on it, for example. Has bacteria on it, for example. Yes? Faith, iman, is only when there is a hidden element. Without any hidden element, the meaning of faith and iman no longer has any meaning. It's gone. Then you just have science. It's one thing for you to put your hand on the stove and see that it burns. This is basic science. It's another thing to believe that when you lie or you take the wealth of an orphan, that you put fire in your belly. This one you have to believe because you can't see it with your own eyes. See the difference? There always has to be a hidden element for iman to even have any room, any meaning. So now question for you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, do this, do that. Shouldn't there be even a little bit of a hidden element in this process? Doesn't He have to tell you, do these acts of worship, they're beneficial for you, without telling you exactly what the reason is, for there to be a hidden element in this process? If I know the wisdom behind every single thing out there, is there any room for iman anymore? There's no room for iman anymore, because that's just science now. So you pray because you know there's benefit for it. You fast because you know there's benefit for it. You do this, you do that because you know there's benefit for you. You already know the wisdom behind everything. Do you believe in the wisdom? No, there's no belief because you already know. It's done. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from you and I to believe. When you talk about belief, there has to be a hidden element, yes? Therefore, you end up in a situation where you say, I'm going to pray, I believe it has benefit for me, even though I don't know what that benefit might be. I'm not going to consume this haram food because I believe it has a negative effect on me, even if I don't know necessarily what that negative effect is actually in real time. I may not know. And in fact, the less you know the wisdoms, maybe one can claim, the more your iman has room to even grow. So it's not a knock against Islam that we don't know the wisdom behind certain rulings. It is in fact what makes Islam what it is. It is in fact what makes any faith what it is. Because if you knew the wisdom behind everything, there is no more hidden elements. Everything is clear. Everything is clear as day. That's science. That's not religion and faith anymore. That's not going to be belief anymore. You know why that is? I'll tell you why. You know the story of Fir'aun? In the story of Fir'aun, this was a man, one of the worst to ever live. He continued to disobey. At one point, Fir'aun, he repented, yes? But when did he repent? He repented at that point where all the hidden elements became clear to him. So he knew he's not going to be in this world anymore. He saw the akhirah in front of him, in front of his two eyes. Then he said, Al-an amantu. Now I believe. أنه لا إله إلا الذي آمنت به بنو إسرائيل. I believe in the God that Bani Israel, this whole time we're saying, He is the God. And what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala respond to him? Al-an وَقَدْ عَسَيْتَ مِنْ قَبْلُ وَكُنْتَ مِنَ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Now, what does it mean now? Does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not give us multiple chances to repent to Him? Yes. But as long as there's still a hidden element in your life. But when you see the akhirah in front of you, you know for a fact you're being drowned now, you don't see the dunya anymore. You see the truth and the reality of matters now. There's no more hidden elements. Of course, everyone on the Day of Judgment will obey God. Because there's no hidden elements. They see the power of God directly. Now he sees himself drowning here directly. Sees the power of God in front of his own two eyes. Now he says, I believe. I'm sorry, the room for belief and iman, gone. There's no more hidden elements anymore. Now he sees he's being drowned. He says, I believe. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, unfortunately, not only is your belief has no value at this point, فَالْيَوْمَ نُنَجِّيكَ بِبَدَنِكَ. We're going to hold on to your body so that it becomes a sign for future generations. Yes? And that is why some scientists believe that the bodies, some of the bodies of the pharaohs that have been found are of the bodies of the time of Musa alayhi salam. Because this was the promise of the Quran, that we would save your body لِتَكُونَ لِمَنْ خَلْفَكَ آيَةً, so that it would be a sign for the people who come after you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He unveils certain truths for us. But some elements of the faith have to remain hidden. Because if everything in this faith is not hidden, everything is clear and clarified, such that you can see it with your own two eyes, there is no more room for faith or iman anymore. With that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's talk to an end. Sallallahu alayki. Ya Fatimah al-Zahra, sallallahu alayki, ya bint Rasulillah. If we can dim the lights, inshallah, and take our hearts to the city of Medina, where our beloved mother is in pain, our beloved mother is in agony during these final nights. The narrations tell us that this city of Medina, who once used to be a city of joy, a city of happiness, the city of the prophets, now since the Prophet has passed away, Medina has become a city of oppression. It has become a city of injustice. And no one respects the Ahlul Bayt the way they used to. Now the companions of the Ahlul Bayt, the numbers continue to drop more and more. And now Ali ibn Abi Talib walks through the city of Medina, and some people don't even respond to his salam anymore. And now some people disrespect this family of the Prophet that he commanded everyone to respect and honor after he was gone. And now the city of Medina has turned into a city of agony and pain and sadness. And even more so than anywhere else, the house of Fatima. And the house of Ali has turned into a place of sadness. Why? Because the mother of the house, who used to bring joy to this house, who used to bring energy to this house, now the mother of this house is in the deathbed. And she's not doing well. And every day her pain is increasing. And every day the masa'ib are increasing. And the narrations tell us of those final moments of the life of our mother Fatima. Because the narration says when those final moments of the life of Fatima came, then Fatima, she had Hassan and Hussein around her. She had Zainab and Kulthum around her, the other children around her. Then she turned to Ali and she started to make her final wasiyah. And she started to make her final will to Ali. And every line of the will of Fatima is a painful line. What did Fatima say? Fatima said, Ya Ali, after I take my last breath. Imagine what the heart of Ali ibn Abi Talib is going through. Imagine what's going through his heart when he hears these lines coming from the mouth of Fatima. She said, Ya Ali, when I leave this world, then I want you personally to take care of my ghusl, and to take care of my kafan, and to take care of my body. But there is one thing I want you to do, Ali. I want you to make sure that you bury me during the nighttime. Because I don't want the people of this city to come and pray on my body. I don't want the people of this city to know where my body is buried. Imagine how much pain Fatima went through. Imagine how much injustice Fatima went through, that even when she's leaving this world, she says, I don't want these people around me in those final moments. I don't want them to know where I'm going to be buried. Then she continued to speak to Ali. She said, Ali, when you put me in the grave and you pour dirt on my body, then sawwid turab, yes? Make the dirt, all of it equal around my grave. And Ali is just listening, but you can tell maybe Ali in these moments, the tears are flowing from his eyes. And slowly the body of Fatima becomes weaker and weaker. And as the time continues, then Fatima turns to Ali in those moments. And all of a sudden, Ali sees that Fatima is not speaking to him directly anymore. It seems as though Fatima is seeing something from the other realm. And then all of a sudden, she said, Assalamu alayka ya Jibra'il. Oh Jibra'il, my salam goes to you. Imagine what these children are dealing with in these moments. Imagine what Ali ibn Abi Talib is dealing with in these moments. When he sees his own wife is speaking to the next realm. And then she started to give salam to her father. And then she started to give salam to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And she sees the angels who have come to take her soul. And the final words that Fatima said according to this narration, she said, Ya Allah, take my soul, I want to be with you, not far away from you. As slowly the body of Fatima lies there, a lifeless body. This was not an old woman, this was an 18-year-old girl, yes? This was a woman who was very young. But oppression took her away from Ali ibn Abi Talib at such a young age. In those moments, Ali says, I began the ghusl and I began the kafan. But when I came to close the kafan, I thought to myself, this is the time for the children to come and say their final farewell, to say their final goodbye to Fatima. So I called out, Ya Zainab, Ya Kulthum, everyone come. Let these children come and gather around the body of their mother. Have you ever seen a mother leaving this world? Have you ever seen how the children gather around this body? They want to see their mother one last time. And Ali said, فَهَذَا الْفِرَاقَ. This is the moment where you will be separated. وَاللِّقَاءُ فِي الْجَنَّةِ. And the next time you will see her will only be in heaven. Imagine these children gather around this body as they say their final goodbye. At least Fatima has her children around her to say goodbye to her in those final moments. At least they can see the body one more time before it is stabbed, before the body is cut into pieces, before the body has horses trampling it, and so on and so forth. But what happened on the 10th of Muharram? La yawm ka yawmika ya Aba Abdullah. What happened on the 10th of Muharram? On the 10th of Muharram, Hussein's body was lying in the plains of Karbala. Did any of the children have a chance to come and see this body? No. Because the moment Imam al-Hussein was martyred, then all of a sudden, all of this army looked at the tents. And then all of a sudden, these women and children, they started to run in every corner, yes? And as the army came closer and closer, these young children, their hearts beating faster and faster. And some of them, the narrations say, the jewelry on their ears and the jewelry on their body was going to be taken away from them. And then they come and they set the tent on fire. And all of these tents are on fire. These children are running, each one of them in another direction. And Zainab is running from one corner to another corner to get all of these children, get them all back into one place. And Sajjad is ill and Zainab has to take care of him as well. What happened to the heart of Zainab in those moments? Did these children get a chance to sit by the body of their father? Not until the next day when Sukaina came by the body of Imam al-Hussein. She threw herself on the body of Imam al-Hussein and the pain was so much. She then started to cry and cry until she fainted on the body of Hussein. And Hussein recited these lines in poetry to her. Hussein told Sukaina, from now on, tell my Shia, Shi'ati ma in sharibtum ma'a azbin fadhkuruni. Whenever you drink a little bit of water, and that water quenches your thirst, remember the one who was thirsty in Karbala. Aw sami'tum bi gharibin. Or if you hear of someone who's lonely, who had no one to take care of him, who had no one to support him, then remember the one who was left alone in the plains of Karbala. This was the situation Sukaina got to say her final farewell to the body of Hussein. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawmi al-zalimin. وَسَيَعْلَمُ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا أَيَّ مُنْقَلَبٍ يَنْقَلِبُونَ. Let's take a moment to recite a couple du'as, inshaAllah. First and foremost, for all of those who are in pain, all of those who are in difficulty. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He frees them from their difficulty and pain, inshaAllah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of those who are ill and ailing, especially those in Palestine who have been wounded by this aggression. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He grants them health and afiyah, inshaAllah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that all of us who have hajat, all of us who have requests, all of us who have different needs from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, some of which we've told others, some of which we've kept in our hearts, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants all of our hajat and requests, inshaAllah. And finally, last but not least, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the return of our beloved 12th Imam, bin Nabiyyi wa alih, rahimallahu man qara'a surat al-Fatiha, ma'a as-salawati ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah rabbil alamin.